All right. So this is a fascinating episode on the life and times of Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, who, as you know, was the former Prime Minister of India and also a modern statesman, a poet among much else. His achievements certainly are something that few have emulated since and will emulate going forward as well. We have Ashish and Rajiv discuss plenty of different aspects ranging from the politics, managing coalition partners, and getting some of those difficult decisions done during some tumultuous years, and down to his policy as well. I mean, we talk about the Golden Quadrilateral, the new telecom policy, and so on. And, we also talk about certain events like the Kargil War, the Pokhran tests, the Parliament attack, and so on. So there is plenty that we discussed in this mammoth 2-hour podcast on Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. If you're even mildly interested, go down to our YouTube channel or do check out our podcast on all audio platforms like Anchor, Spotify, Google, Apple, and so on. I can assure you, you won't be disappointed. Namaste and welcome to this very special Bharat Varta live stream on Good Governance Day, also the birth anniversary of former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. So I have with me two very special guests. I have Ashish Chandorkar who joins us. He's an author and noted columnist. You've heard Ashish speak about many different matters related to politics and policy. Welcome, Ashish. Thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Gary. Good to be here. I think it's only two of us right now. Rajiv is having some internet difficulties, looks like.
All right. We have much to discuss on this podcast, but I guess we'll begin with that central question that we are asking today. Is Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji India's most underrated Prime Minister? And we'll begin with you, Ashish. What do you think?
And given that Vajpayee was the first non-Congress PM to complete a full term and actually serve when he became PM thrice, but completed one full term. I think until in the last few years, the evaluation of his legacy definitely was a little harsh. He did not get the credit, especially on the economic side, for what he really ushered in. The other thing is that what is not written about a lot is that Vajpayee gave the political parties in India a context or a reference that he can actually, a non-Congress PM can actually survive a full term, right? I think that if you see the politics before that, 1977, there was a first non-Congress government which lasted about 3 years, and there were several contradictions in the government. There were actually two PMs in that 3-year term. And then VP Singh government had an issue. It kind of fell very early on, after which the two United Front governments came in. Again, there were challenges with that. Chandrasekhar government had a 6-month run earlier. So all the non-Congress governments basically had a very short tenure. They were unstable. And the general perception in the politics was that no non-Congress party or a set of parties can really command a nationwide presence. I think one thing which is not, for which Vajpayee is not given enough credit, is that he changed that assumption in the politics. His tenure changed that assumption, that it gave the confidence to the BJP that it could be a national party to start off. And then, of course, the regional parties' aspirations grew because they could then participate in Delhi. Of course, they did it with the UF government also just before, after the 13-day Vajpayee government. But I think his tenure made the coalition importance, or the coalition dharma, as it's now called, much more prominent, front and center in the Delhi politics.
Right. Fantastic. Hey, Rajiv, thank you so much for joining. Again,
thank you, Roshan. Sorry for the technical issues there.
No problem at all. So for our audience, just a quick intro of Rajiv. Rajiv is an investor and also he's now a best-selling author. His new book, A New Idea of India, is co-authored with his friend Harsh Gupta and has been endorsed by the who's who in India, including the Prime Minister himself. So welcome, Rajiv. Thank you so much. Good to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Rajiv, before you joined, we were trying to answer that central question, which is, is Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji India's most underrated prime minister? And Ashish had just ended his answer. Would you also want to, chime in on that?
No, most certainly. I think underrated and also in many ways underappreciated. Because frankly, the changes that he made in India and for India changed the world in a significant way. So if you look at the South Asian region and India's place in the sort of the economy and sort of geopolitics as well of the late 1990s. So Vajpayee ji became prime minister at a very delicate time. It was a time of great uncertainty in India because, as Ashish was describing, we had seen three, four prime ministers come and go, and it seemed like, could there ever be a non-Congress government? Could there ever be a party besides the Congress which could sort of provide that stable governance, provide that leadership to the country? And Atalji was the first. Vajpayee ji was the first. Like, he was the first prime minister to complete a term, and the changes that he brought in foreign policy and economy put India on a different trajectory altogether. And by virtue of doing that, actually, he changed the world in a significant way. So, I've always thought that his role, his leadership, has not been studied enough, and his changes have not been viewed in the context of the broader rise of Asia and what we have seen unfold in the world in the last 25 years with the changing geopolitical equations.
Right. Yeah, and these were certainly difficult times as well. I mean, since we are living in the times of a pandemic, I mean, there was plenty of natural calamities that time as well, right? There were cyclones and droughts, and aside from that, I mean, there was this whole tension with India and Pakistan, which we will go into further depth as we discuss various facets. Rajiv, in your opinion, how would you rank his key achievements? Maybe at this point you could just name a few of them. We can go into further detail later.
So, if I had to just summarize very succinctly, Roshan, I would say Vajpayee ji connected India in a physical sense and also in a kind of virtual sense. So, physical sense with the massive build out of infrastructure, all the roadways programs, expansion of those areas. The railways were doing very well under Nitish Kumar at that time, who was the rail minister. So the infrastructure works of that period, and obviously we all know about the telecom policy of 1999, which really laid the foundation for the unbelievable boom which came in the following 10, 15 years. And obviously now we all take it for granted that everyone in India has a phone, some of the cheapest call rates and data rates in the world. But it was not obvious 20 years ago, and the person and the government who changed that was the Vajpayee government.
Right. Ashish, same question to you.
Yeah, sure. See, the way I look at this is that the Vajpayee government took a very sectoral view of Indian improvement and Indian reforms. The Manmohan Singh reform, the PVNR Manmohan Singh reforms were more scaffolding type in nature, in the sense that they had a broader view, more macro view. The Vajpayee reforms were around a very sector specific improvement. And taking on from what Rajiv was saying, let me name a few areas in which this government really took some very key steps. So civil aviation. Today we have private airports. Why? Because the Vajpayee government brought in the policy of the privatizing the airports, which of course later on picked up once the Manmohan Singh government came in. Divestment started around his time. He was the one who really, for the first time, thought about the whole divestment process and sold off about 32 companies. If you look at power, electricity, today, of course, we still are in a bit of a soup, and we just had a very good episode just preceding this episode on an Indian power sector. But the last 2 decades have been quite transformative, even if they've not been optimal. I mean, we still have a long way to go, but whatever has been done in the last 2 decades owes itself to the Electricity Act of 2000 to 2003, which the Vajpayee government brought in. He also changed the way India looked at its energy security. So, for example, the policy of acquiring overseas for oil fields. So that's what again was started, and that's another form of connection, which is where you use your economic interests to supplement your foreign policy interests. So the Sakhalin oil and gas field, which was acquired in those times, was the first one. And now, of course, all our companies are fairly active in the foreign markets, and something which we actually praise China for, right? Like that they control the natural resources market. India actually got into that race just like 15, 20 years ago. Uh, Insurance, another form of financial connections, where the insurance reforms which came in, again, it completely revolutionized the industry. It created a new service sector in India. If you remember, the years between 2002 and 2010 were actually the boom for financial services, right? Practically, whole bunch of MBAs who graduated in India in those 7-8 years actually went into financial services because private banks were booming, private insurance companies were booming. So the financialization started around his time. GST, which today is live, it took like a good 20 years to go live from 1998 when it was first proposed, but it was again a Vajpayee era legacy. The first groundwork happened around his time. Rajiv talked about a road network already, but both, I mean, Golden Quadrilateral as well as the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana part was his brainchild. Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which the iconic ad where the kids are holding Vajpayee's hand and they say school chale hum, right? So or school chale hum is how he pronounced it, right? The ad became quite iconic in itself. Again, the whole question of getting education to the grassroots for villages to improve their educational access, etc. All of that again started with his government. So yeah, I mean, a whole bunch of things. There are some other things also, but the sectoral transformation, the piece by piece changing of how India progressed and developed. I think we owe it to pretty much that government.
No, and I think the biggest change was just the change in psyche, because I think at that point in 1997, 1998, in many ways, I think India had stopped believing in itself. I think somewhere people had stopped believing that things can actually be changed and improved for the better. But here came in a government heads down for 6 years. They implemented all these path breaking policies, and the fruits obviously sort of followed slightly later, because as Ashish has often pointed out, many of them were like that trickle down effect took longer to sort of materialize, and the fruits came slightly later. But that trajectory was set in the late 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes you is the how fundamental these reforms were and how far-reaching they were. I mean, as has been pointed out, I mean, we're still feeling the effects of some of these reforms, right? I mean, whether it's the telecom sector or a few other places. And yes, we'd love to go into some of these nuances. Let's talk about some of the significant events during his tenure. I think the first major event was the Pokhran tests in May of '98. After which India became a full-fledged nuclear state, and it wasn't easy again. I mean, this countries. Rajiv, talk us through that time and how Vajpayee ji handled the situation.
No, so clearly this marked the single most important shift, right, in a nuclear policy sense for India, and doing those tests, not sort of carving down to like threats from, let's say, the United States or other Western powers, and we should remember at that time Indian economy did not have that heft, right? So today we are about a 3 trillion economy, $3 trillion GDP. Back then, India was a much smaller country, and internally again, that kind of psyche was there. That wait, what will this country say? What will that country say? And should we do it? The British might say something, the Europeans or the Americans might say something. And this government came in, they decided to do the test. And yes, other countries did sort of obviously push back against that, but obviously, I mean, they took the stand that this is good for India, and they stuck with it, and they made the case. There was obviously a very significant diplomatic fallout, and that is where the Prime Minister, along with his NSA, Brajesh Mishra, they went and they made the case for why India needs to have nuclear weapons, and India enunciated clearly the no first use policy, and sort of presented itself as a responsible power in front of the world. And obviously, the sanctions came in at the beginning, but then very quickly the US turned around the US sort of left that sort of stance against India. Bill Clinton, President Clinton, came and visited the country, and then I think even the seeds of the current sort of increasingly deepening US India partnership, the strategic, not formally an alliance, but a strategic partnership that is there today. The seeds were really sown in the aftermath of Pokhran.
Can you on mute?
Yeah, I think first time in about 75 episodes I've been on mute. So yeah, that was an interesting development. I mean, this was also the time when India was being made to sign that CTBT treaty, right? And we held off against that. Yeah, so this was a pretty significant event that time, and
No, and
also
Roshan actually,
immortalized on screen.
yeah, and there were many internal
Yeah, go ahead,
dissensions,
Rajan.
right? There were many internal dissensions in the Indian sort of. There was no political consensus actually on this, at least formally. So I remember someone like the Congress president at that time, I think Sonia Gandhi, she had said real Shakti comes through sort of, that self-flagellation or whatever. She used some better word for it. And Amartya Sen had opposed it. And Jyoti Basu
Right.
had opposed it. Jyoti Basu was a very powerful figure at that time,
Right.
communist chief minister of West Bengal. So they all had opposed it. Even in the bureaucracy, there was a certain resistance. That there was a certain thinking of the mindset of pacifism, that India should not do this. We are the land of non-violence. Not taking a realistic kind of or a realist kind of a stance, but having these kind of what maybe people would talk in Gandhian seminars. They wanted to convert that into a foreign policy.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just going to mention the movie Parmanu, which was a John Abraham starrer. I think it was pretty good. Ashish, about a year later in '99, we had the Kargil War, right? This was just after the famous bus ride to Lahore. And I think for many of us in our generation, I think this was the first full-fledged war that all of us lived through. What are your memories of this period?
See, Kargil war was a very interesting phase. We should remember that this war happened when the Vajpayee government was actually a caretaking government, right? Like the 13-month government had fallen between 98 and April 99, and Vajpayee ji was the caretaker PM when in fact the attack happened precisely because there was political turmoil in India. And AIDMK had just taken off support from the government, and of course the consensus was that the government was quote unquote not popular, which is how the media had portrayed it. And this whole coming together of Sonia Gandhi, Mayawati, and Jayalalitha, which was facilitated by Subramanian Swamy, I think that had caused the government to fall. So there was no full-fledged government. So it was a very difficult period for India to negotiate and navigate. Also, India had been sanctioned by the US, just around that time, just after the Pokhran testing. So our access to arms and ammunition, our access to the general sentiment was not very positive for India, right? In that time. And despite that, of course, the war itself could have been a failure of intelligence, but that also because there was no permanent government. So I'm sure there must have been some issues in terms of coordination between the government and the military and so on. But once we got the hang of what was happening, our reaction was pretty strong and pretty forthright. And I think that did eventually boost Vajpayee ji's chance to become the PM. I mean, the election which happened later this year, I think in September, October of that year, he won a majority. I mean, India won a majority fairly easily, with BJP raising its tally as well. So the country also rallied behind him. I think what it taught, in my view, that war really, I think, changed the way. One was, as Rajiv talked about, that there was a lot of self-flagellation in those times. While I think that changed with the war. People from my generation, people who were just kind of getting into the voting age or who had just got to the voting age a few years ago, I think they started thinking of India in different ways. There was much more confidence around the fact that we can actually win something against Pakistan, even if it was in a difficult condition, and we actually paid a very heavy price for it. In terms of our brave men and so on. But at least the result kind of vindicated some of that. and the fact that there was a longer term thinking needed around how to handle Pakistan. I think that is also what probably came into picture, because the whole death by 1,000 cuts was, I mean, Musharraf was like the champion of that strategy, right? I mean, even later on, and we can talk about it in some time, but even parliament attack happened soon after that, a couple of years later. So the whole Musharraf tenure was really a very difficult period for India, when he was like the proxy or direct ruler of Pakistan.
Right.
And I think that that war really changed, I think, Indians' own perception about the country, and gave them more confidence that yes, if the leadership is in the right hands, then the country can progress and can make gains, despite of the adversities.
Yep, definitely. And let's talk about the parliament attack itself. I think it came in. It was in December of 2001. 5 Lashkar and Jaish militants managed to infiltrate the Parliament House, and this is when there were about 100 MPs and politicians still in the building. It could have been so much worse, right? I mean, it could have been crazy worse had it not been for the bravery of the CRPF and Delhi police, right? Ashish, overall, this was a very harrowing time, right, when it comes to security, national security, and so on.
Yeah, I think even before we get into the parliament attack, Kerry, let us look at the timeline before that, right? So what happened was that Vajpayee ji was quite invested. I think this could be one of the criticisms of his government also, that he was quite invested in the whole peace with Pakistan doctrine, right, which was the Delhi consensus. And the Delhi consensus also said that a strong and a self-reliant or a self-sufficient, self-confident Pakistan is good for India. Actually, what we've realized is, to use a MJ Akbar phrase, a jelly state is better for India, which we have seen in the last 2 decades, rather than a strong Pakistan. Because every time Pakistan grows strong, they start needling India in some ways. I think that was one of the, probably a bit of a folly, but I guess that was the conventional doctrine in those days. So it wasn't like a significant departure as such. But Vajpayee ji did make a attempt to foster peace even after Kargil. Much later in 2001, what happened was the Agra summit, which had taken place in July 2001, when Pervez Musharraf had visited India for 2 or 3 days, and there's a whole bunch of song and dance around the supposed treaty and so on. And then, despite apparently agreeing on some consensus, which would have made LAC the default, the LOC as a default LAC, effectively, like the China border. That was scuttled. What we know is that either Advani ji or some of the supporters, some of Musharraf's advisors, basically scuttled it, and I think it was for good, because that kind of ended that chapter of the Pappi Jappi style of politics once and for all. I mean, it did come back again with Sharm el-Sheikh about a decade later, but largely speaking, I mean, it was a good kind of negative evidence against Pakistan doing anything constructive. So the parliament attack was again one of the death by 1,000 cuts episode. I mean, like when Musharraf did not get the treaty, and he still did all the grandstanding. He still tried to portray himself as a victor, much ably supported by Indian media itself in terms of how they evaluated the outcome of the Agra summit. Everyone blamed Vajpayee ji and Advani ji for the failure, and they said that Musharraf was wrong. We called him, and then we did not give him a treaty, etc. All of that. And that happened in July. And I think the parliament attack was really his way to retaliate and to basically, massage his own ego. Of course, there were other reasons, like Musharraf was then trying to take control of Pakistan soon in the aftermath of 9/11 in US and so on. So I think he also chose the timing right, because everyone was busy with, the Western world was busy with Afghanistan and Bin Laden. So, he basically chose the timing very well. And I think it's the credit of the security forces on the ground that day that the attack got foiled. And it could have been a terrible day for India. I had even not just the PM, but practically both the houses were in session, right? So even if a fraction of MPs were killed that day, it would have been a terrible day in Indian history. But I think credits to the security forces that we kind of prevented that. And I think that again was another evidence that Pakistan cannot really be trusted with its words.
Yeah. No, I think if I remember correctly, it's the house was adjourned maybe an hour, couple of hours before that, and there were still about 100 odd people in the building. It could have very well developed into a hostage situation, and what we saw in 26/11, right? Basically, so it could have been a much worse situation, I would say. So let's shift our gaze to international relations. I mean, there was plenty that was happening on the global scene at the time, right? So let's maybe begin with India and US relations. Obviously, we've spoken about the Pokhran tests. It was viewed as a serious intelligence failure for the US. And we had also taken a very strong stand against the CTBT treaty and so on. Rajiv, overall, how do you view India-US relations during that time?
So at that time, I think, see, the context was the Cold War had kind of come to a close. The Soviet Union had sort of broken down, uh, and essentially the world was, the US was the de facto kind of, only leader, kind of unchallenged power in that sense. And India obviously started reforming in 1991 with the industrial delicensing under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. So we had just been about 5-6 years, 7 years into that reform process, and then Pokhran happened. Pokhran tests were conducted by the Vajpayee government. So in that context, actually, then the sanctions came. The international community imposed sanctions. International community led by the US imposed sanctions. So I think the India-US sort of relationship did not have that time to sort of evolve in that 5-7 year period. But what the Vajpayee government did extremely well, I think, was that they connected economy and foreign policy in a kind of new way. So let me explain that a little bit. So when the sanctions came in, then obviously, the outreach happened. The sort of for many foreign countries, India went and sort of made the case why India should have a strategic sort of use or strategic ability to deploy nuclear weapons. And along with that, India started opening up more and more. So if you look at the kind of reforms that came in India, Ashish had just described some of them. That 6 year period, and one of the books that really sort of delves into great detail on this is Dr. Arvind Panagaria's book, India, the Emerging Giant. So he really sort of lays it out sector by sector on the changes that were coming. And what the Vajpayee government did was they sort of pitched India as a business destination, as an investment destination. They told the Americans, they told other countries that, come invest in India, work in India, build businesses here. We have a large consumer base. There is demand for all kinds of products here. So they opened that new angle, and I think that was something new, because it was kind of liberalization, economic liberalization, going hand in hand with a certain type of new foreign policy. And I think obviously the Americans got that right. So that was, I think, the beginning in a way of significant sort of US investment coming into India. Ashish was talking about the boom in capital markets in the first decade of the century, the 2001-2 period till about the financial crisis, those 7-8 years. So the amount of capital that then came into India, into the stock market, the private equity sector opened up. So even both primary capital settled on a scale which had never been imagined actually by anybody. So all that came in, and it was really a brave attempt. I mean, if you're now, it looks obvious in hindsight, right? But if you're standing in 1998 and if you're thinking it through, that this is what we're going to do, it's a very bold and kind of courageous effort, and that really paid off for the country. And obviously over 10 years, then even after Clinton came and went, the Bush government came and went, Obama came and went, India and US relations in particular have only gotten better with each sort of president.
Right. So I think the Clinton visit was the first visit by an American president in 22 years. And also, I think around that time was when this whole notion of demographic dividend was sort of touted and positioned, right? I mean, up until then, I feel like this whole Abadi Barbadi trope was prevalent all through. Pretty significant times when, we were positioned sort of in that global stage. Ashish, this was also the time when I think India-Pakistan relations were the most strained, right? By, in my estimate, in the last 3 decades itself. What do you think?
Yeah, I would actually go a step further, Carrie, and say that actually could have also been taken a big toll on the politics of the country, leading to the government's losing the election itself. I think Vajpayee ji had to spend far too much time on Pakistan and on significant events. I mean, not too much time just in terms of Pakistan being there and being retributive and being a troublemaker, but actually in terms of on ground action, right? And I think that probably also was one of the reasons why like he lost the election because of the fact that far too much energy was spent there. Let me recap that, right? So we spoke till about the parliament attack, but what happened, Carrie, after the parliament attack is actually what was most significant part of the Pakistan relationship. India was, of course, under the pressure of to do something about this attack, right? To attack Pakistan or to basically do some kind of a surgical strike, etc. The attack happened on 12th of December, and 2 days later, Advani ji, who was then the deputy PM and the home minister, actually made a statement in parliament saying that we will. I mean, there was a neighboring country aided. I mean, which aided the terrorist groups which carried out the attack. So we practically called out Pakistan immediately after that. But then we did not do anything for like a few weeks. We kept, and of course India was probably underprepared with all the sanctions history and so on, not having access to arms and ammunitions. So, but it was on 8th of Jan when Advani ji had gone of 2002, when Advani ji had gone to the US to basically, probably talk about Indian intent of doing something militarily. That must have been the purpose of the visit. And that is when he was told by the US authorities that President Musharraf General Musharraf was going to make a statement on Pakistan's behalf, which he did 4 days later, and promised that he actually called out the attack himself, saying it was a dastardly act, etc., tried to kill Indian democracy, all of that. And he actually himself called out LAT and JEM as terrorist groups which shouldn't be doing all this. And I think India was kind of forced into accepting that statement as a rapprochement attempt from Pakistan and take his view sincerely. But again, just 4 months later, 5 months later, in May of that year, May 14th, there was this infamous Kaluchak attack where the terrorists attacked the families of Indian armed forces. We lost 34 individuals in that attack and 50 were injured. It was similar to the Pulwama attack, which happened in Feb 2019. Very, very similar coat trails of the design. Again, India was again under pressure, and that's when we launched the Operation Parakram, right? When India fully mobilized 500,000 troops on the border, and it was actually I think Vajpayee ji was let down by the military establishment in that time, in the sense that it took us 3 weeks to mobilize like half a million troops on the Pakistan border, and actually that India lost the strategic surprise, and in fact the whole plan had to be abandoned. But there was a lot of political pressure on him to do something about it, which kind of carried wave. I mean, that pressure lasted for a while, and Operation Parakram actually unfortunately claimed almost 1,800 Indian soldiers. Because there were mine blasts and there was Pakistani shelling. So there was a full 1 year when India and Pakistan were not at war, but the conditions were very warlike. India, in fact, actually bombed some ranges which Pakistan were occupying as late as May 2002, right? So the whole year was kind of wasted on Pakistan when actually he should have been preparing for the elections in 2004. And I think that took a lot of energy away. And it was only towards like end of 2002 when both India and Pakistan suffered the cost of mobilization. I mean, I think India spent like upwards of $1 billion in mobilization of that year, and Pakistan suffered, put $500 million. I think that's when the two countries kind of backed down after staring at each other for a long time. So in that sense, I mean, in hindsight, you can say that, in fact, Admiral Sushil Kumar, who was a Navy head then, had actually later on said that Operation Parakram was a big failure, and India basically paid a big cost for that failed. I mean, both in terms of men, material costs, and so on, money, and so on. So I think that whole Pakistan issue. I mean, of course, in hindsight, you can always judge an act or a set of decisions, but right from starting from the Kandahar attack till this point, I mean, Kandahar hijack till this end of Operation Parakram, India had a torrid time with Pakistan. I think Vajpayee ji probably suffered a lot politically because of that. The credit which should have accrued to him for his economic policies, and they continue to do work on the economic side despite all of these issues. 2002 actually was the landmark year of reforms also in many ways. A lot of the new things happened in that year. But that credit never went to him because the general chatter and the general media narrative was just about Pakistan. And I mean, I just hope that what India has proven now, much later, 14 years later in 2016, was that surgical strikes are an option. Nuclear escalation is not the natural escalation from point one to. You don't go from a terrorist attack to a nuclear attack like in one day, right? I think India broke that myth now. But ideally, had he done that one thing, which wasn't the consensus then, and maybe Indian military was not as strong, so that could also be a factor. Things would have been very different for himself in 2004 and for the country.
Yeah. So Rajiv, any comments on India's relation with China or the rest of the world? Very quick comments, and then we can move on to infrastructure and development.
So, one of the most remarkable things I think about Vajpayee ji is that he was probably, in my opinion, the first prime minister who placed a lot of emphasis on economic growth explicitly. He talked about it frequently. He talked about the importance of even private enterprise. In fact, one of his, I think, a speech which he gave in 1998 to the annual session of the Confederation of Indian Industry, he made a very explicit appeal that all political parties please set aside your partisan considerations, and he said that this is the time where the country has to focus on just growth and growth. In so many words, he said that, and to that end, actually, if you look at his career arc, his life arc, he had seen how poor Southeast Asia was, how poor China was. He was a foreign minister in the mid 1970s, in the Janata Party government in 1977. So he had even seen how some of these Asian countries had made rapid progress in 20 years, like from the 70s, 80s to the 90s, and he could also see that India, has not really made that much progress compared to, let's say, what the ASEAN Tigers did, or even China, which started reforming in the late 70s under Deng. And obviously, Japan obviously was the biggest story of that time in the 1980s. So he actually, in his economic policy, he sort of learned from the economic sort of results achieved by these countries, and I think tried to take India in that direction. So what was called the Look East policy. Now, obviously, the current government says Act East, but I think it was Atalji who had said initially that Look East. Learn from the Asian neighbors, including countries like Singapore, including countries like China and Japan. China obviously was much smaller that time. It was not as sort of big an economy as it is today. But that economic aspect, I think he intuitively grasped that very well. That you cannot have any kind of international influence, you cannot have any kind of say in the world if your economy is in tatters. And India's economy was in tatters in the 1990s.
Right. Fantastic point. All right, let's move on to infrastructure and development. Ashish, Vajpayee's tenure must rank as perhaps one of the most significant times for infrastructure development in India. You had things like the Golden Quadrilateral and the Pradhan Mantri Gramin Sadak Yojana, right? So, your comments on all of these developments during that time?
Yeah, definitely. I think India, for the first time during the Vajpayee government tenure, understood that you needed a hard infrastructure development or hard infrastructure advantage to really grow the rest of the economy. I remember having this discussion on a previous podcast, which was hosted by Kushal, where Harsh, Rajiv, and I had participated, and we had discussed that how in the US, if you see your policies around freedom, economic freedom, less government, etc., all of that happened much after let's say the whole New Deal expenditure on infrastructure and so on, right? US first made expressways and connectivity, etc., all of that, airports and all of that, and then started talking about free economy and so on. India actually, we never had any hard infrastructure. We never really focused on it. In fact, if you remember, like the Maharashtra government of 1995 to 1999 was perhaps the first government, then Shiv Sena BJP government, which really focused on the whole concept of road building and so on, right? And and a good thing was that Nitin Gadkari, who was then the state minister, he was the cabinet minister in Maharashtra state, then became that model kind of got taken over by the Vajpayee government also, in terms of road connectivity and so on. Then BC Khanduri, who was then the minister in Vajpayee government, really focused a lot on building highways and of course launching the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. So I think one issue which India has had, let's say via the US or other countries, is that we have spoken far too much about the government being less interventionist without having the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure to really make it happen. Government, it's okay for government to not intervene, but then how will people talk to each other? How will they communicate? How will the markets get made? How will demand and supply match each other, right? I think all of those economic questions we answer in theory without having realized that we never had the enabling aspects of it. I think Vajpayee government really changed that, and the good thing is it continued thereafter. I mean, I think for the next 20 years we've had several marquee projects which have gone live, and I think the governments can no longer ignore the fact that you need at the minimum like the road connectivity and the data, the electronic connectivity. I think that's the legacy of the Vajpayee era.
Rajiv, any comments from you?
No, yeah, I mean, on infrastructure, like I said initially, Roshan, connecting India. So, today, obviously, I think people take that for granted. That obviously we can drive there, and there is a flight and there is a alternative available for transport. But there was a time when these things were much more complicated. You couldn't just like drive down from, let's say, Bombay to Goa if you felt like it that easily. It was more difficult, and I mean even other kinds of sort of roadways were not there. I remember there is a very good New York Times article that came out, I think in the early 2000s, which actually traced the kind of history of how much infrastructure has been built in India, where, how, etc. And it said that there were more highways built in that 5-year period than they were built in the first 50 years of independence. That was the scale on which the Vajpayee government was working. So the number of kilometers they built in those 5 years exceeded the entire stock of highways and expressways in India. I mean, there were no expressways actually. So before that, so again, when something like this happens, it opens people's eyes. People start thinking, wait, this can also be done. This is also possible. And then they say, why don't we do it earlier? And then, you realize that the level of incompetence that came before this government. Again, in Dr. Panagaria's book, he has actually cited parliamentary debates where somebody is saying, why do we need roads? No one has a car over here. So we should not build any roads. It's a waste of money. Things like that. So just the transformation of, connecting villages to towns, connecting towns to cities, connecting cities to each other, and that entire intricate network of moving people, moving goods from point A to point B. It's a very simple idea, but the commerce and sort of internal sort of mobility it enables is something phenomenal, which I think now obviously again governments take for granted. Particularly some of the BC state governments are doing amazing work on this. Uttar Pradesh, for example, which Prime Minister Modi called Express Pradesh. He said Uttar Pradesh should be called Express Pradesh because of the scale on which they are developing infrastructure. So now people obviously take it for granted, and even Congress governments might be doing it. But for 50 odd years in India, this was just not happening. Something as simple as this. So this is a very big credit actually to the Vajpayee government, that they literally changed people's minds on this issue in India.
Right.
To add, Carrie, just one point here. I mean, carrying on from what Rajiv was saying, not having roads was actually our official defense policy until about 10 years ago, right? Like there were statements made like, if you don't have roads in Ladakh and Arunachal, then China cannot intrude in India. Actually, even on that front, the India-China Border Road Project, ICBR, I think that was launched during the Vajpayee government era, where there was a vision of making roads of, some 2,000 roads or something, of which a lot have been done now. A lot of the projects which Vajpayee government had launched are being completed by the Modi government, right? So
yes,
in terms
yes.
of railway bridges and tunnels and roads and all of that. So I think even the ICBR part was actually the Vajpayee era legacy, which is now getting completed. Will probably take another 3-4 years to really complete all the 2,000 roads that were identified. But yeah, I think the whole concept of India being able to travel from one part of India to another, which should have been so obvious, actually only came in around 99-2000.
No,
Right.
and just think of the
Yeah. So
incompetence. It just shocks me every time, when I think of these things, just think of the incompetence that is there. I mean, people are saying we don't have a car, so there's no need to have a road.
yeah, I mean, unlike any policy decisions which require nuance or whatever, I mean, it seems like common sense that we need to have roads and airports, right? I mean, uh, I the fact that that is political and the fact that that hadn't happened full scale or full potential until then, I mean, shows what weak governments we suffered, right? All right, so
No,
speaking
and
of
then and
policy,
then
there
you
was
have
plenty by
movies.
way of
I was just saying, then you have movies where
yeah, good,
people are living in villages, going on a bullock cart, and then those movies get a national film award. The director gets a Padma
right?
Vibhushan, and this is the image of India that we create of ourselves. Actually, unfortunately, it was almost like the government is doing this to the people of the country.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they had packaged poverty
Until
and
the Vajpayee
backwardness.
government changed the game.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there was plenty by way of policy as well, right? And one of the prime wishes on social media, especially of the BJP followers, is privatization, right? And Ashish, one can say that the Vajpayee era was a golden period for that, with Arun Shauriji as the Minister of Disinvestment. There was the sale of VSNL, Hindustan Zinc, Balco, IPCL, several ITDC hotels, modern food industries, and so on in that 5 years of 99 to 2004, I would say, right? So, yeah. So, your comments on that?
See, I have a slightly more nuanced view here, Carrie. I think, yes, clearly government should not be doing stuff like making bread or running hotels. I mean, that no two ways about that, right? But I think on the divestment side, I believe that there was far too much dogma when it happened. I mean, of course, that's the only time it has happened. So when you say it started with Vajpayee government, I mean, that's the only time it actually happened. So it started and ended with Vajpayee government. In that sense, we really haven't done a lot of divestment since then. And maybe it's changing in the next quarter, in the next 2-3 quarters, where we will see some of the larger assets being sold. But I think my view was that Arun Shourie got too dogmatic about his views on the divestment side. What happened was that you couldn't club, let's say, running of a bread making factory to, let's say, divesting BPCL or divesting, say, Air India, which had far more important ramifications. So because these companies were just equated as all were same, like all centrally managed companies, CPSEs and so on. I actually think that we probably lost the case because of that. Had we gone a little slower on that process, but build a process of what needs to be divested. And again, when you make a process, you need to take a call that, are you divesting because the government should not be in that business, or are you divesting because you're getting a good price for it? I think the two questions got intermingled in that time, right? So, for example, in the hurry to divest and to kind of do the signaling, we actually sold some assets, including even the hotels. I mean, look at the Centaur Hotel in Mumbai. It kind of caused a lot of grief when the government sold it at some price, and it was sold 6 months later at about 30% extra price to another buyer, right? So I think clearly government left some money on the table because of the dogma there. If the question was that we shouldn't be doing it at all, that's a different policy. But I think that was not very clearly articulated. And what happened because of that was that then the government machinery started working on other areas like BPCL around that time, or HPCL also was being talked about. In the same vein as say a modern bread or let's say a Centaur Hotel, which I think was kind of stalled the process forever. So I think a Vajpayee government would have created a much better legacy of institutional divestment, but because they came from the point of view of the thought process that government, we are doing it because government shouldn't be owning these assets, rather than saying that government should actually own a few select assets and can only look at divestment when there is like really the right value available. I think that distinction was not made, and I think that is the reason why the program. Of course, I mean the UPA government never wanted to do divestment. That's a different thing. It was not as part of their program, and given that communists were practically part of the first UPA government, when clearly that was going nowhere.
One of the first orders of business actually in the UPA one was actually converting the Ministry of Disinvestment into the Department of Disinvestment. It was downgraded.
Yep.
Right. So Rajiv, you have any comments on this?
No, yeah, no, I think the push they gave Roshan was, I think it was again very very courageous, because it was against the grain in India, completely against the grain. I mean, it is something where a few people in government knew this is the right thing to do for the country, and they did it against the media opinion, against like all kinds of public opinion. The most remarkable sort of success there obviously was the corporatization of BSNL and the privatization of VSNL. So BSNL was corporatized actually in the same way that this government, the Modi government, is proposing to corporatize the ordnance factory boards and this and that, and obviously the defense sector unions have raised hell for that. But before the Vajpayee government, until the Vajpayee government did the corporatization of BSNL, it was a sort of a business existing within the DOT, Department of Telecom. So they corporatized it. BSNL was sold again to Tata's in a transparent auction. So some of the pace actually which Ashish is highlighting, I guess what he's trying to say is that they probably went too far too fast instead of building consensus, and going in a slightly more calibrated way would have made that push more durable probably, and probably that's a fair assessment. Uh, but uh, but the way the process was run for the first time in India, again, I think it's a great credit to the Vajpayee government that in a country riven by corruption, in a country where every neta is sort of very you look the other way and they sort of have a bad reputation of dipping into the pocket, right? So in that kind of an environment, they ran a very clean process for the most part. There are some isolated cases like the Centaur case and all that, but for the most part, there was transparent bidding. And we were talking about that. I think Hindustan Copper, Balco, and so on. So it was actually Anil Agarwal who outbid an established company, the Aditya Birla Group. I think he outbid them by a significant margin to buy those assets. And then it was considered like, he has made such a huge bid. How will this ever make money? But it turned out that it was the value that was being unlocked by transferring some of these assets into private hands. Change in management, change in practices as part of coming under private sector. So these assets really delivered massive output then. And I think I forget the exact numbers, but I believe the amount the government now gets in dividend from some of the assets sold to, I mean, the government still owns a stake. They own about 26% or so in some of the companies that are now controlled by Vedanta Group. So the dividend they get on an annual basis is more than what they got as a stake sale at that time. The annual dividend
Wow.
itself is far outstripping what they got by selling the equity. And obviously that company has grown like probably 50 to 100x or something. Uh, but just the fact that they did the right thing against sort of conventional sort of opinion, and sort of delivered for so many sectors, not just the telecom one obviously, but even areas like the metals industry saw a big change in India. I think the efficiency that came in metals after that, because of the divestment and all that. And then obviously with tourism also, some of the hotels went. Today, some of the iconic hotels that have been divested were initially actually owned by the ITDC, the government entity. So all in all, it made a statement that, again, even for external observers, for foreign investors, that wait a minute, this government is actually serious about reform, about liberalization. So I mean, that message also went out from India for the first time, that
Right.
something different is happening here.
Right. Rajiv, I know we spoke about this in the Geo episode that we did some time back, the new telecom policy. And in fact, I mean, recently, I think Sunil Mittal also mentioned that Vajpayee ji can be truly called the father of modern telecommunication, for some of the stuff that he did in 99, right? Do you want to talk about the the telecom policy at that time, the national telecom policy?
No, yeah. So this is one of my favorite sort of topics, and I've written at length on this, including in our book, A New Idea of India. I think it is a case study actually for how to sort of unlock a sector's potential. So what the if I had to really say it in a few sentences, what the Vajpayee government did was unbundling. So what was happening was, at that time in the mid 1990s, the ministry, the nodal sort of department, was both the dispute settlement body. It was also providing the service. It was actually running a telecom business inside the ministry as part of the department activities, and it was also making the policy for the sector. So imagine the layers of the conflicts of interest over here. The same department is setting the policy, the same department is running a telecom business, the same department is settling the disputes. Even as it is allowing private sector players to come in, they are only settling the disputes. There is no, independence there. So one of the things the Vajpayee government did was they separated out the service provision activity into BSNL. They made the TDSAT, the Telecom Dispute Settlement Appellate Tribunal, for all telecom issues. That became like a kind of a nodal court for that. And the policy making role was left to the government, and there too they created the TRAI, Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. So and interestingly, Roshan, okay, so let me sort of ask you a question. What do you think was the goal of the NTP? Like, they set a goal, right? When they announced the policy in 1999, they set a goal that in 10 years, our objective is India should have X percentage of telecom penetration. So just for some background, at that time in 1999, maybe it was around 2.5% or so, 2.5 or 3%, not more than that. Because the goal in actually the 1999 NTP was that in 10 years, we want to get about 10% penetration. So basically, they were looking at a kind of a tripling or quadrupling in 10 years. And obviously, by 2010, I think the results had far exceeded the modest expectations, relatively modest expectations in hindsight. And probably half of India had phones by 2010. And obviously, 10 more years later, the entire country has not just voice connectivity, but even internet connectivity. So we have a very affordable internet service, telecom service, and we are closing in on first world standards on that front. So this was enabled actually by the telecom policy, which basically said we will share revenue with private players. So the government said, let BSNL and MTNL take a step back and let the private sector drive this industry. And the government will sort of take a share of the revenue that is generated. And obviously, these will be industries which will create jobs, which will pay taxes and so on. So net, it was actually, it was a very large industry created from scratch. And as many industry leaders have acknowledged it, like you mentioned, Sunil Mittal, Roshan, even Sanjeev Agha, who was the former head of the former managing director of Vodafone Idea. What is Vodafone Idea today? He had said that the 1999 NTP was a watershed event in the industry because it was a clean break from what the government had been doing. And frankly, when the policy was announced, the media had, as usual, completely panned it. I think Outlook magazine had called it a scam or something, and Frontline had said that this is another sort of failed sort of hype being created by the government. I mean, very, very critical articles came out against the NTP. But the success of that policy is there for all to see. So it was just about letting the private sector drive the train, take the lead, and sort of government taking a step back, which again no one had thought should be done or could be done until the Vajpayee government sort of did so.
Carry on a lighter note, even Bharat Varta has a telecom policy output, right, or outcome, right, this year. So had 4G not become cheaper in India, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So.
Of course. And considering Rajiv has joined from his mobile phone, right? So how would all of this be possible, but for all of that, right? So fantastic. So
Ashish, and again, I refer to Dr. Panagaria's book, Roshan. Again, in Dr. Panagaria's book, he has cited like some parliamentary debates happening in the 80s. And actually, the person who was, I think, some people have given him credit for the telecom revolution, Sam Pitroda. He had actually tried to stall the sort of evolution of wireless connectivity in India in the 1980s, as Dr. Arvind Panagaria said in his book, India, the Emerging Giant. And again, he cites over there, the kind of discussions that are happening in the 1980s. Oh, why will people want to talk in India? Who wants to talk on a phone? Literally, MPs, ministers are thinking on these lines.
Right. Yeah, fascinating how things are actually, So Ashish, education was again, a major sphere of reform, right? You had the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, as you had alluded to earlier. Do you want to elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, I think the whole Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was a very crucial social program. Again, probably in few years' time, we will talk about it more fondly. But I think the whole concept of the human development indices focus came with that program in India. Of course, there were some other offshoots. I mean, sorry, the other predecessors of this program, like in states in Tamil Nadu, for example, there used to be like a midday meal driven program in the MGR times. Even in 93, 94, the PVNR government had done some work on some kind of a universalization of education. But this whole national push came for the first time with the Vajpayee government with this SSA program. And it was also launched in a very modern way. I mean, I talked about this School Chale Hum song, etc., aired on TV. TV, by the way, then was exploding, right? Like if you see 96, 97 is when the private channels, the private news
Private channels came in. Yeah.
So I think the government really, leveraged that very well in terms of passing on the message of universalization of education. And the fact that the PM was doing it himself, like he was, in those days, I mean, PMs were not as accessible on TV or social media as which we have now, right? So it was not thinkable that the PM will do an ad for a government program as such, right? So I mean, the fact that he put his personal equity behind it made a lot of difference. And of course, that is what kicked off the whole process of universalization of enrollment and then the tracking of data. Today, when we talk about the tracking of the MMR, IMR, school enrollment, school dropouts, midday meal efficiency, all of that. Again, you can trace back the origins of that to this program. And even the RTE, which was brought in by UPA, which was kind of the where UPA worked on the concept of rights rather than the duties of the government. But I mean, even that was essentially an offshoot of the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan itself, because in the last 10 years that the program was active before RTE came in, the plumbing for the education had already been done in most states, right? So UPA government could then go a step further and say, let the education be a fundamental right for the children rather than just a service which is being provided by the government. So I think quite creditable, because this whole concept of investing in human capital, and again, this is where there's always this classic debate of capitalism versus socialism. I think both the BJP government, both NDA 1 and now NDA 2 with the Modi government, I think they have taken the view that human capital is a form of investment, and capital as an economic resource itself, right? So while you can talk about these policies like education or roads or water or sanitation, etc., as socialist, but the fact is that actually leads to a complete overhaul or complete transformation of the quality of human capital in the country, which then becomes a much more productive economic asset. I mean, where the productivity itself goes up significantly. And as we know, productivity improvement is the holy grail of the GDP growth beyond your the usual government interventions. So I think in that sense, I think Vajpayee government was the first one to really recognize that having human capital as an economic construct is what India should focus on. And I think that has taken leaps and bounds. I mean, many leaps since then in the last, let's say, 20-25 years.
Yeah, that's a very important nuance that you mentioned, Ashish. And I think I see that as a common trait between the current Modi government and Vajpayee ji's government as well, which is not really getting into this left-right dichotomies, and rather, looking at education, healthcare, so on, infrastructure as investments that can actually spur productivity and growth, right? Yeah. So Rajiv, we have plenty of political questions, the usual questions on the 2004 laws, so on and so forth, coming forth, right? So please keep the comments and suggestions coming. We'll take them we'll take them shortly when we discuss that aspect of Vajpayee ji. But Rajiv, one question on the capital markets and this whole financialization that we spoke about, we touched upon briefly earlier, right? Do you want to talk about that briefly before we move on to the political side of things?
No, for sure. So if you rewind back 25 years to the 1990s, so I think if I remember correctly, SEBI was formed in the aftermath of the Harshad Mehta scam that happened. So this is, imagine there's no securities regulator in the country till about 1993 or 1994, if I'm remembering the date correctly. And frankly, stock market and all this, they were considered to be, just giant casinos, where people are doing all kinds of shady stuff, which, I mean, it is not even a respectable profession. Like today, someone says I'm an investor or I'm doing equities trading, that people think that yes, this is a serious job. But 25 years ago, if you're doing trading, what are you doing? Is that really a job? Why don't you start a business or set up some industry? That was the kind of thinking back then, probably for good reasons, because the way exchanges were being run in India. So there was I think every region had an exchange. It sounds absurd now, but there was a Delhi Stock Exchange, there was a Madras Stock Exchange, there was, I think, even Kanpur Stock Exchange. Like smaller towns and cities also had stock exchanges. Indore Stock Exchange. And there was the biggest one for Bombay Stock Exchange and Calcutta Stock Exchange. And NSE was only formed, I think, in 1996, if I remember correctly again. And it was, there was the idea of buying shares in a company or holding a sort of equity position. This was all very sort of, a very small, maybe select group of people in places like Bombay understood actually that this is actually serious stuff, and you're buying a piece of a business, and the business can compound and it can create wealth. For the most part, it was a wild west. And all that started changing in the 90s. In a way, the parallel I like to give is the way RERA has come in, the real estate sort of regulation has come in the last few years, and that is creating a kind of consolidation in the real estate industry. In the same way, in the 1990s, a certain consolidation and formalization of capital markets had started, and that gave rise to what we today call the financial services industry. There are large brokers, the likes of Edelweiss didn't exist, right? Edelweiss is very much a creature of that reform process. Motilal Oswal, all these large firms, they all came up in that period. And, then obviously, I mean, probably the process had started before the Vajpayee government came in, but it certainly got an impetus under Yashwant Sinha and Jaswant Singh, who were the finance ministers, where, I mean, it has been a perennial problem in India, right? That Indian households overinvested in land and gold and underinvested in Indian businesses, sort of parking savings into equities has, not been the norm actually at all. So that started changing as SEBI came in, as the NSE came in. So ultimately, the Calcutta Stock Exchange kind of also vanished in a scam in the early 2000s. And then NSE and BSE became the two main exchanges in the country. And all these regional exchanges were basically dissolved over time. And here we are today, 20 years later. There's obviously two main exchanges in the country. The regulator, there are all kinds of, I mean, issues and problems also with the way financial sector regulation is happening. But we are in a much better place to convert savings in India into investment for growth companies that are listing on exchanges and so on. And frankly, even what Vajpayee government did by opening sectors to FDI in a significant way, like by sort of selling the India story abroad, going out there and telling people invest in India. They made an effort in that sense to paint a positive, a very positive picture of the India story, making growth a priority. So all this drew in like even FIIs, foreign institutional investors, who've obviously not left at all. I mean, every year, they are sort of investing heavily in India. But again, like I would say the most significant achievement of the Vajpayee government, if I had to say it in a nutshell, would be they essentially converted India from a frontier market to an emerging market. So what was, in the late 1990s, India was like a frontier market. Frontier market being, one of the kind of unstable countries with a small stock exchange and all of that stuff. And by the end of their tenure, I think India had become one of the emerging market stories, where global investors would seriously look at investing in India by 2003-4. Uh, Indian sort of savings were being parked more into stocks and so on, into financial savings, rather than sort of land holdings or gold. And obviously, what this government has done, what the Modi government has done, is taken it to the next level. Actually, it's kind of all interconnected with the attack on black money, sort of incentivizing sort of holding of financial assets versus other kind of assets. So they've actually had a very consolidated strategy to drive financialization in the country, not least of all making it easy by digitization. So today, obviously, with widespread mobile sort of connectivity, cheap data, everyone having phones in their pockets, people are trading on their phones, people are moving money around through UPI. All this has really made a very big difference, where even small amounts of money can be then mobilized into equities, which would not be possible if you had to do the paperwork. So I think this is in fact, financialization is still probably got long ways to go in India. I think we are still at the very early stages actually. Huge progress made in 20 years, but I think long ways to go. If you look at the number of demat accounts in India, or look at the share of stock ownership by household, I think it's still severely underpenetrated. So it's an ongoing work. But yeah, I mean, what the work that was started in the mid 1990s, late 1990s, and carried on till date, it has created a new industry. As Ashish was mentioning earlier, all those graduates in the 2000s, most of them landed, in different banking, finance, insurance jobs, which were connected to the opening up of the financial sector for the first time in a big way.
Okay, just to add a couple of points here on the finance side. So the FRBM, or the Financial Responsibility and Budget Management Act, was passed during the Vajpayee years. This was, of course, that government also focused on low inflation, etc. And the fact that states should be responsible about their budgets, I think that concept came in during the Vajpayee government. We have had debates on how it should run since then, but I think the concept that India as a country should be fiscally responsible, I think that was another change of stance and change of, let's say, the popular economic folklore in the country happened in that time. Secondly, the introduction of national pension system. India was spending a lot of money on
pensions too.
But the whole NPS came in around that time, which again has now, I mean, after say 15, 20 years, is now really realizing its full potential about people trying to define their benefits, defining contributions rather than defining their benefits. So I think the whole, the putting the onus of your own retirement on yourself rather than the government doing it. Again, it was a very fundamental shift of how people thought about the government's role in the economy. And that was a very, very, very important shift which happened, because had it not happened, India would have been spending a lot of money. The government budget would have had a far greater proportion of revenues revenue expenditure today compared to the capital expenditure, right? So I mean, as it is, it's quite bad even now, but would have been much worse. So the fiscal space which the Vajpayee government opened through those two interventions is also something which should be remembered and credited for.
Right. So one evidence of how much was done in that period is the fact that we have spent 75 minutes just only broadly covering some of the stuff that was done on the various aspects, right? So we haven't even gotten into the politics, and we haven't even gotten to the person yet, which is something that a lot of people are interested in, and so I think we should talk about it now. So let's talk about Vajpayee ji, the politician. Right. Of course, I mean, he is regarded as sort of the founding stalwart of, the Jan Sangh and the BJP. Right. So, Ashish, there have been a couple of books, or more than a couple of books, out on, Vajpayee ji's contribution specifically on, to BJP's, founding and rise and, current dominance. Right. How would you characterize this?
Yeah, I think, see, he, of course, shot to fame because of his oratory, right? So once the Jansangh leaders realized that he had a great potential as a speaker, that is what really put him front and center of election campaigns. And then he, of course, was a very popular campaigner in the earlier times, where he would come and speak for an hour, couple of hours in rallies. I think that that really made a significant difference also to the way BJP later on, after 1980s and Jansangh earlier, put its point across, because he was considered. I mean, Vajpayee's criticism in Parliament actually carried a lot of weight. What he said, people heard seriously, and I mean, his speeches, both from the 1996 debates and 1996 debates, were like the first time when the government fell in 13 days. I think his speech is still remembered, right? And he kind of said it in Parliament that we will come back again with a greater force, and we don't care if we are going out now. I mean, that speech is still it's part of the political folklore. I think everyone must have really heard that speech. So I think in that sense, as a politician, he was fairly conventional. In fact, I would, and we can go into the details of this a little bit, but I mean, that would be one of my kind of complaints, that he transformed economy in a fairly significant way. But I think he conducted his politics in a very traditional way, where he probably paid the price for it, and also in terms of the losing the election, losing the re-election. But I mean, he probably was a very nice person and a nice politician, assuming that will be reciprocated. But unfortunately, some of his adversaries were not that kind to him in terms of both behaving in real life, and also how they positioned him as a PM. I think that probably, if one thing had to be changed in that era, I would say, to be the politics of that era, and not the policies as such.
Right. Rajiv, this was also the era of coalition politics, right?
I would just add to that. Yeah, I would just add to that, Roshan. So, I mean, his oratory, like, obviously, if you see on YouTube and Google for Vajpayee speeches or something, you find hundreds and hundreds of videos. What is interesting is many of them seem to be uploaded by his fans. There is no central effort happening that someone is coordinating his videos and putting them up. I think it is his fans and his admirers who are actually, finding clippings and putting them on YouTube. And some of these videos have hundreds of thousands and millions of views actually. So that is the magnetism of the man. That those who listen to him, they are mesmerized by him. He was this amazing speaker, and sitting in 2020, let's try to imagine that world of the 1970s and 1980s. Most homes don't have television, there are no phones, there is obviously no internet. So you basically get your news in a newspaper the next day, and it's very hard to conceive of that world sitting in the 24/7 connected world that we live in today. But in that world, obviously, the charisma and the ability to sort of get a point across in a pithy way, in a sort of humorous way, even in a sharp way. I mean, he was also he could be very critical, but in a sort of way that the critics, the object of his criticism, would not really know also what hit him. So so in that world, his style really mattered. That someone who heard him would always remember that speech or that line or that way of expressing a point. So in that world, it was of enormous import actually. So that oratory aspect, I mean, people share anecdotes even till date as to how he said something, and then his opponent had no answer to that.
Yeah, right. So, Ashish, there are plenty of questions, as you would expect, on the 2004 loss. We have Dhruv Singhal, who says, how was the party's performance at the state level during Vajpayee's tenure? Was that a factor in the 2004 loss? We have Siddharth Singh, who is asking, why was Atalji's government not chosen once more after 5 years? Then you have another question, reasons for going from 50 seats in Lok Sabha and UP in 98 to 30 in 99 and 10 in 2004. So on and so forth. We have plenty of questions around the 2004 election loss. How would you characterize that?
Yeah, so I think I would put 2 points there, Gary, in terms of explaining the loss, and of course, all of this is with the benefit of the hindsight. But see, the first point was that I think Vajpayee ji's politics was not as ruthless as his economic reform was. So as while BJP had the central government, or it was rising in India in that period, it did not do enough to consolidate its position in the large states. And I'll take 2 examples. One is Maharashtra, one is UP. Maharashtra, the Shiv Sena BJP had a government from 95 to 99. The elections happened in 99, where first of all, NCP and Congress fought separately, but together they had only 8 seats more than the BJP. There were like 30 independents which were there in the house. BJP did not. I mean, of course, this was time when BJP was not. I think BJP was still a junior partner, so initiative also rested with the Sena in that sense. But apparently, the local talks or the local folklore is that the BJP refused to form the government again with Sena because it found it difficult to run the first government. So I think that kind of judgment, where the entire game was about how to attract the 30 independents. Congress plus NCP also had to do the same thing, and BJP and Sena also had to do the same thing. But apparently, the BJP did not force its way in that government, which I think it could have been a very expedient political call in a very localized sense. That the local leaders were not happy with how the government went, the first government went. But nationally, the party paid a a very very heavy price for it. In Lok Sabha election, when the elections had happened together in Maharashtra, 28 seats, okay, and it could have easily attracted the 30 odd independents to form the government, but they refused to do that, and then they couldn't come into power for 15 years after that, right? I mean, the next time the BJP got power in Maharashtra was in 2014. Similarly, UP, and someone already gave the stats. I wanted to mention that. In 1998, BJP had 57 seats, I think, in the United of UP. So 50, I think 53 or 54 in the current UP. Then that fell to 29 in 99, again in the combined UP, and just 10 seats in 2004. So the way BJP handled Kalyan Singh was really, I think, a bad political call during those times. Kalyan Singh actually stayed out of BJP for almost the entire duration of Vajpayee government. I mean, he was out of party between 99 to 2004. So the fact that I think the party saw the whole the whole political scenario in a very ideological and idealistic sense. I mean, Kalyan Singh was a rough leader. The fact is that his government was dismissed because of the Babri Masjid incident, etc. And he never shied away from taking the quote unquote the claim for it, right? I mean, he has been very clear in his interviews that he didn't want to follow what the PVNR government was telling him, or what the Home Ministry was telling him around that time, because he wanted that Kar Puja to happen, and basically, I mean, he didn't feel bad about the demolition. But I think the let's say the rusticness or the subaltern nature of the politics, BJP tried to avoid that, despite that being their core vote base in North India, right? I mean, the party was actually strong when it won 186 seats. Also, the bulk of the seats were coming from North only, right? And so you wanted the votes, but you did not want the voters as individuals, right? And I think that kind of a approach did not go very well in certain segments, and especially in UP, which is where they completely lost the plot between 99 and 2004. Also, the alliance with Mayawati fell away, there was an alliance forged with her, which fell away. They put a very lightweight candidate as CM for a year, again apparently on the behest of the top two, Vajpayee ji and Advani ji. So I think some of the decisions politically were, I think they were trying to cater to the commentariat lobby, and not to the not to the voters as such, right? And even if they didn't look and feel nice, even if they were not pretty in the conventional sense of how media evaluates politics in India, I think that BJP paid a price for that, definitely, partly in 2004. There were tactical mistakes also around alliances in AP and Tamil Nadu and so on. So I think that also was a challenge in that election. The second part is, I think that maybe Vajpayee ji, and again this is a hypothesis, that maybe he viewed politics just like economics as a trickle down system of people evaluating performance, right? So in economics, it's possible that you do something at the top, and 5 years later the bottom part of the value chain improves because of the improvements through the value chain. But politics is more here and now. Politics is more immediate in nature, and even if you look at the election timing, the 2004 elections were actually preponed, right, by a couple of months, because not a couple of months, actually by 6-7 months, because the 99 election happened in September, October, November timeframe. So this happened in March, April, May timeframe, right? So it was significantly preponed. And the reason was that because they thought that they have done so much work economically, India is shining and we should take the advantage of that. But actually what happened was that even the 8% GDP growth which India hit in the Jan, Feb, March quarter of 2004, the print came only in May after the government went away, right? So no one knew that India had hit 8% GDP mark while the election campaign was going on. So I think the whole this tying of economic policy and the vision to the immediate benefit, what the countries or what the voters what will accrue to them now, I think that story was missing. And the rural economy was had a stress. There were 2 droughts in 2001, 2002. India had not come out of that yet. And the fact that BJP was losing key states, there were rebellions in states, plus the fact there was a Pakistan pressure of all of 2002. I think they did not fully unwind these things, and they just became too many. And they just thought that like the macro picture was looking good. That macro picture will reflect in the macro politics also, in the sense that it will trickle down. And that did not happen. And I think that was the reason why they paid the price for. And again, a lot of urban supporters for BJP, right? Like people thought that the party is going to win, so they just did not vote. Like a lot of people did not vote. I mean, I think all of us will personally know people who ruled later on that we did not enroll to vote at all for that election. So I think those were some of the factors in my view. Bad judgment on the political side, basically, and not giving enough importance to some of the very subaltern concerns in the country, which is not driven by economy.
Yeah, and I think we
I would actually just add.
Yeah, go ahead, Rajiv.
I would just add one thing to that. I mean, I largely agree with Ashish, but there is also something to be said for the constraints in which that leadership had to work. Right. So we are talking about the media, for example. Now, obviously, if you compare it to the current dispensation, there's no doubt that the Vajpayee government was probably more sort of friendly or open to working with the Lutyens media. Now, why is that so? Well, they had an enormous power to set the discourse, which has frankly been whittled down by the internet. So today, the Prime Minister and all the sort of senior leaders in Delhi, they are able to form a direct connect with the voters through digital platforms. 20 years ago, it was a very different system at work. You had to go through newspapers, you had to go through television channels. That was the kind of medium to reach people. So and then obviously we should remember Vajpayee ji and Advani ji never had 280 and 300 plus seats. They were working with fragile coalitions. They were balancing many factors. So that kind of what we now see as softness was probably necessary to hold everything together. Because even 1 or 2 sort of individuals who control their parties, 1 or 2 individuals sort of walking out for some reason or not playing along would bring the government down again. And India had already been through a cycle of continuous elections, unstable government, unstable sort of base like that. So I think that was a severe constraint on them, and I think we should just look at that slightly more empathetically. I often find that in 2020 we sort of look at it and say, oh, but they could have done this, they could have done that. But I think the set of constraints they were working under were far more different.
Sure.
Far more severe.
Yeah, I think we have a bunch of questions, on comparisons as well with other leaders and so on. So we'll take them in a bit. Rajiv, one of the things that Vajpayee ji did also was, mentor a lot of the relatively younger crop of leaders, right? Whether it's Jaitley ji or Sushma Swaraj ji or even Gadkari ji and ultimately Modi ji as well, right? So, your comments on that specifically.
No, I mean, obviously, many of the senior most leaders today, even the defense minister Rajnath Singh ji, he too was sort of among the younger guns of that period, right? So no doubt, I mean, they created a sort of strong stable of next generation leadership, which is what carried the BJP through the kind of difficult years in the wilderness during the UPA era, uh, uh, putting in place sort of dynamic young chief ministers, giving sort of space to individuals like Jaitley, Rajnath Singh, and other sort of senior individuals who are now senior individuals or seen as the key forces behind this Modi government. They all sort of cut their teeth in that period in the 1990s and late 1990s and early 2000s. So there is something to be said. I mean, obviously, it was a remarkable sort of move again in Indian context, because even today we have family oriented parties, and even then we had family oriented parties. So finding talent, grooming that talent, giving people
Yeah.
a chance, I think it was a very unique thing which BJP has always done.
Right. So, all right, let's get down to the comparisons now. Obviously, we have a bunch of questions, from the audience comparing Vajpayee ji with Modi ji, right? So, Ashish, you have a couple of questions. Did the party expand in states and new regions as it has done under PM Modi's tenure? I think you've touched upon that earlier. Then we have someone called Mendax who says, do you think the pace of pushing India forward was faster during ABV's time or now with Mr. Modi? Quick comments on these two.
Let me talk on the first one on the party expansion. So I think no, the party did not expand that strongly in during the NDA one time, and I think I still think that was the only broad mistake which the party made, that it kind of tried to focus too much on the strong areas while trying to work via alliances. I think the difference in the Modi Shah world is that even if there are alliances, they will still want to push their party agenda, even in the states which are being governed by allies. Right, so even the allies are on. Allies also kind of stay on toes for most part. So I think that was a difference. Maybe again, as Rajiv said, the constraints and the situations were different. Maybe they thought that India could genuinely work like a federal polity where the parties come together for a larger cause and remove the narrow differences aside, and the concept of CMP can work. I mean, common minimum program for the first time was applied. I mean, of course, it was used in the UDF government also earlier, but of course, it was more broadly applied during the Vajpayee government. So I think that kind of that construct was probably more appealing to them given the situations. But I think that took away the focus on politics in my view. That is one part. On the second one, the speed of decision between then and now, again the problems are different. If you look at the pyramid of, let's say, if you envisage the economy like a pyramid, right? The Manmohan Singh PVNR regime in 1991 touched the apex part of pyramid, which is to look at the macro picture, right? If you look at the Vajpayee years, as Vajpayee government years, they took the middle part of the pyramid and took a sector by sector view of reform. So they if they had 20 things to look at, they chose, okay, what 15 things to attack, and they attacked those things for reform. The Modi government has the entire pyramid to attack, because there's a need for a new macro reforms, because the 91 reforms have played their part and run their course. The sectors are changing because the sectors have changed, have significantly evolved actually between in the last 20 years. What was important then may not be important today. And then, of course, the Modi government has also done this direct touch point with the voter, with the citizens, right? Where they want a central scheme to actually reflect to the voter directly without any middle chain in between. So that's a different approach, I would say, on the reform side for the Modi government. I think both are crucial, and both have their own importance. I would not compare them in a good versus bad sense. I think the contexts are different, and the approach is also quite different.
I would just add, Roshan, I'm very curious to run a thought experiment as to what would a Vajpayee government with 300 seats look like. What would be the policy positions on some of the contentious issues, some of the more aggressive sort of political debates that are happening. They obviously had to take a very moderate stance and play the establishment line, running a coalition. But with 300 seats, it changes many things.
Right. So, there are quite a few sharp contrasts between the Vajpayee era and the Modi era that we are in right now. One is, the obvious political machine that, BJP has become at this point of time, right? I mean, you have focus right down to the municipal elections. I mean, you saw that recently with the Greater Hyderabad municipal polls, for example, right? Which was obviously not the case earlier, right? Then you have this mainstream embracing of Hindutva as an ideology right now, which again was pretty subdued at that point of time. And also, finally, the elephant in the room, there are leaders like, Arun Shauri, Jaswant Singh, Yashwant Sinha, so on and so forth, who were, again, sidelined by Modi ji in his first and second tenures, right? How do you see all these contrasts, Rajiv?
No, I would not see them as being sidelined, to be honest. I mean, see, there is a certain time when a person should sort of hang up their boots, right? So would it be reasonable for, let's say, Yashwant Sinha or Jaswant Singh to expect that, they would again get that role under a Narendra Modi government? I don't know. And I mean, this government is in fact proactively, implicitly, actually, even explicitly, probably somewhere they have said that at age 75, somebody should leave an executive role. And I don't think we'll find too many individuals who are, let's say, running a state government or running a running a union ministry who are 75 plus. There are hardly any, actually. So Dr. Shauri's case obviously was rather unfortunate, as many people on the this side of the fence have felt that he was not included at that time. But then in hindsight, maybe we realize it's the right decision given how things have turned out with him. His intellectual work obviously stands very tall, but whatever he has done in the last 3-4 years kind of undermines his own positions, which is very unfortunate. But I do think that BJP is a party which traditionally has always, like I was mentioning, given space to young talent, new talent, not necessarily even talent from connected to politics. Like if you look at even the current senior ministers, many of them do not come from political backgrounds or political families. In fact, most of them don't. So that wheel needs to keep moving forward. That churning needs to happen, and it's only healthy for, I think, a political party, and it's very healthy even for Indian democracy.
Yeah, Ashish, your comments on this? In fact, actually, we have a related question from Rajat Sexeria. Is it fair to say that Vajpayee and Advani were at the helm of affairs probably past their prime age and hence probably lacked the energy that Modi and Shah have?
Yeah, in fact, I was going to cover precisely that, Carrie, and I think Rajat makes a very good point that the energy in the 2004 campaign physically was missing because of the fact that both Vajpayee and Advani were not fully geared up to campaign in a whirlwind style, which we see today. Again, I mean, 2004 campaigns were not that intense like they are today. But purely in terms of the age, I think the fact that Vajpayee had to be the face of the government, Advani was still not acceptable to the allies. If you go back and rewind to 2004, the election was very much fought in Vajpayee's name, right, despite his age, etc. And allies were not expecting Advani to be the. I mean, even if BJP had that thought that maybe if the government changes, then Advani will become the next PM at some point if Vajpayee were to retire and so on. I think that thought was not endorsed by the allies in 2004. And precisely for the same reason, BJP had to keep out issues like 370, Mandir, all of that out of the CMP. Even if they could have been in their own manifesto, they clearly said that we will go by the CMP. And by the way, BJP did actually stick to that. I mean, if you really see, read the 99 manifesto of the BJP versus the CMP, what the Vajpayee government did was purely CMP based. I mean, they did not deviate from it too much. So the whole concern about Mandir and the issues which really had galvanized the BJP in North India went missing in 2004, right? In that sense. So while and again, like some of these, the fact that the leaders had not changed, the next generation had not become that powerful. The next generation really came in its own between 2005, 6 and now, right? 2013, 14, in those 7-8 years. Remember, Shivraj Singh Chauhan was still not the CM and MP. Raman Singh had just taken over the CM in 2003. Vasundhara Raje Scindia had just taken over the CM in 2003 December. So a lot of the next generation was still not as, let's say, powerful or as visible as as has been the case in the last few years in that sense, right? So the political limitations were also there, and the fact that the two stalwarts were not really at their best campaign wise, just in the physical energy sense, also of course took the toll.
Right. So we have a comment from Srinivas Gaur who says one point that is missed is that Atalji handed over the responsibility of two states, MP and Rajasthan, given to Uma Bharti and Vasundhara Raje. And BJP was the first party that won on a Vikas agenda. Right. Okay, there are a few comparisons to PV Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh as well. Yeah, so either of you can take this. What is the comparison between economic growth in ABV, that is Atal Bihari Vajpayee's era, versus Manmohan Singh? And Siddharth Singh again says, was Congress government led by Manmohan Singh ji better than the BJP government led by Atal ji? So this is like a nice full toss. So either of you can take this. Rajiv?
No. So I would say Roshan, when assessing which government should be given credit for reforms, not doing reforms, etc. Well, you have to look at exactly what policies they have implemented, right? So when someone says that Manmohan Singh presided over the high growth period and there was 8% growth and all that stuff, well, what did he do in that 2004 till 2009 period? What reforms were implemented by the Manmohan Singh government? This was a government that was formed by the vote of 60 MPs from the left front, 60 Communist Party sort of MPs. And they would not allow any liberalization to happen. There was hardly anything happening. So the first Manmohan Singh government was actually coasting on the work of the Vajpayee government. The Vajpayee government sowed the crop and the Manmohan Singh government reaped it. And it was all looking very good because you have communists in a government and you have 8% growth. So you have achieved the impossible in a sense. And obviously after 2009, India came to know about all the corruption that had happened in the UPA 1. So all those skeletons tumbled out only in 2010 onwards, probably. So I mean, we can look at the explicit growth and say that wait, this government delivered more growth, but the question is why? And the answer to that why is that they were riding the growth wave that was created by the NDA 1, by the work of the NDA government under Vajpayee.
Right. I don't know if it was Ashish who mentioned this earlier, that the reforms under PV Narasimha Rao and the reforms under Vajpayee ji were different in the very fundamental sense that, PV Narasimha Rao had a gun to the head sort of a situation, right? It was the whole balance of payment crisis and so on. There was really no choice. But, Vajpayee ji had to engineer or manufacture these reforms, right? And a lot of these went against the grain and were unconventional per se. And, specifically during the UPA era versus now, the thing that we see most is the national security lapses, right? Which is again something that we have, in a good way, we have gotten used to not having too much, activity or frenzy on that front at this point of time. But it was a heck of a time that time, right? So Ashish, quick comments on this before we move on.
Yeah, so I think the national security again. I think the Vajpayee government faced a very, very bad brunt of it because of the whole bunch of terrorist attack which started around that time, and of course they continued until 2013-14. The fact is that with Advani ji being the home minister, I think even the opponents were determined to undermine him and his image of being a strong person. Remember, Advani ji was trying to position himself as the Law Purush, as the next Sardar Patel and so on. I think the opponents wanted to strike at the very core of that idea by continuously hitting India and showing him in bad light, right? So the fact is that with the diminished Raw, I mean, post Gujral years, we did. I mean, Raw had been killed even earlier in the Morarji Desai government, but Gujral government probably just ended the whole thing, right? Like we had no intelligence gathering capability. India was a poor country. Economy was in shambles. The world had sanctioned us for Pokhran. So I think with all that baggage, there wasn't. I mean, the limitations under which the Advani ji operated were very high, right? In terms of not being able to tackle some of these. I think that also continued with the Manmohan Singh government, where it was the same thing, where the terrorist attack became so common that people stopped voting on it. Like, you know, after the Mumbai attack on the Taj Hotel and Oberoi Hotel, etc., the Congress government actually won a fresh mandate just a few months later, because that just basically was no longer relevant for people as a voting this thing. So the fact that I mean, in fact, I had written an article on this in the run-up to the 2019 election, which is that the internal security performance for this government has been phenomenal. I mean, in the Modi government, right? But I think the Vajpayee government had a baggage of the resources not being there to track and stop some of these things, and of course, difficult allies. I mean, remember at one point, National Conference was a ally with the Vajpayee government, right? So I think the considerations.
No, in fact, Omar Abdullah began his
Correct.
political innings under the ND1.
Correct.
Yep. Right. So this has been a fascinating conversation. We're coming up on a couple of hours of discussion, very rich and very insightful. We've covered various facets. Maybe before we end the podcast, I want to briefly talk about Vajpayee ji, the person, right? And again, since he's been a public person, I mean, there are different perceptions and so on and so forth. But what unanimously everyone remembers is the fact that he was a poet, he was a statesman, and I mean, he was one of those people who perhaps had the most impact on modern India, right? I mean, you would probably say among the top 10, top 15 people, right? So Rajiv, how would you remember Vajpayee ji, the person?
So, Roshan, I remember, I think a couple of years ago only, one of his very close associates, Shakti Sinha ji, had written an op-ed in the Hindustan Times about, obviously he has observed very closely how Vajpayee ji used to work. And I remember what he had said in that op-ed. He said that even as Prime Minister, even as in his advanced sort of years, he used to work very hard, preparing his speeches, doing his research, writing, and so on. So it wasn't as if, he had just handed off and, someone else is doing the work and he reads it out or something. But he was a very, very diligent and very industrious individual. And, behind the spectacular oratory, there is practice, there is initiative, there is effort. So, a lot of people may say that he was gifted and so on, but actually what really came across to me from those writings by Shakti Sinha was that he was a very, very industrious man, actually more industrious than maybe he's given credit for. People say that he's a genius, but as the saying goes, behind genius there's 99% perspiration and only 1% inspiration. So I remember him as actually a man of tremendous tenacity, incredible commitment to India, and a capacity for working which probably few people have. Because imagine his life arc, his career arc. His entire sort of life was mostly spent in the opposition benches. I'm sure at various points, maybe the Congress tried to recruit him. They could have dangled a carrot and said, why don't you join us? You can become a minister. You can become a this and a that. But he stuck on his path. He stayed the course with the ideas that he believed in, which is actually very, very difficult over the course of like almost 5 decades. And in the course of that, he's, in a genuine way, Vajpayee ji and Advani ji get credit for actually, creating a bipolar polity in the country, in the world's largest democracy. And through their governance efforts, through what they did with NDA1, they proved to India that yes, there's an option to the Congress. We don't have to be stuck actually with one party and with one family. That India can do better, that there are big things that India can do in even cutting edge areas. One of the slogans of that period was IT is equal to India's tomorrow. Again, the IT industry today, obviously, global export sort of powerhouse for India. But 25 years ago, 20 years ago, it was not taken for granted that India could actually make a mark here. But the government pushed that forward. A new age industry like that, they pushed it. So even having that kind of positivity in an environment of complete sort of, hopelessness almost. After 50 years of independence, there was hopelessness in India. That, we are still poorer than even Pakistan on a per capita basis by the 1990s. And so many countries have kind of done better. But their contribution is, it's really in nation building. It's, I think, without parallel in India actually.
Right. Rajiv, you've mentioned more than a couple of books along the way. You mentioned the Arvind Panagriya's book, and then you mentioned also Shakti Sinha. Any other books that you would suggest to our viewers to understand more about Vajpayee ji?
So particularly on the topic of disinvestment, disinvestment secretary at that time, Pradeep Baijal. So Pradeep Baijal had written a book, Disinvestment in India, I Lose, You Gain. And that book gives a lot of details on the disinvestment process, how it was run, what the priorities were, what the challenges were. It's almost comical in some places where they're trying to sell a hotel and they can't find any of the papers, things like that. So the kind of logistical, legal kind of challenges of actually doing something like that. So I think that's a very good book on understanding how privatization happens. So I would highly recommend that one too.
Right. Yeah, so a couple of books. I think Jugalbandi by Vinay Satpathy, which has just come out as well, and hopefully we'll have Vinay on the podcast in January. And I think the Vajpayee years by Shakti Sinha ji as well, who we will likely have on the podcast soon. Right. So these are a couple of other books that one could look at. Ashish, final question at the end of this marathon 2-hour discussion on Vajpayee ji. Right. How would you remember? How should one remember Vajpayee ji, and what was his contribution in a nutshell to India?
See, I remember him, Carey, as a politician who changed the cynical nature of Indian politics. In 1996, when he resigned after 13 days, there were endless debates in my engineering college on his speech. Right, the passionate way in which he talked about that he will not do jod tod to save his government and actually would rather come clean and win a fresh mandate whenever that opportunity arises. I think that was a seminal moment. I mean, see, if you see in 1980s, late 1980s, the politics had become very cynical with this whole Mandal Kamandal issue, and there were a lot of opposition to the Mandal movement and so on. Like the entire North India was burning. There were riots throughout that period. If you see the era between 1984 and 1993-94. It was a very bad phase for India as a country. There was a lot of communal strife. Country was kind of just directionless, right? People were just happy to get past another day of their life. There was nothing to really look forward to in terms of new things happening and so on. I mean, it partly, of course, changed with the liberalization, but the social structure did not change until 1994 when, until when the riots continued. So I think the Vajpayee ascendancy to the first term, which was only 13 days, I think that was the most significant part to me in a lot of people's political perception, because that really made them think that politics could be different. There could be people involved who may have a very good intent and they may want to do something which you can relate to yourself, right? And need not be expressed in the terms of vote banks or clienteling type of propositions. I think that to me was the biggest contribution. I think a lot of us of my age, if we are interested in politics today, it is because of Vajpayee ji. And that is kind of encapsulated very well in one of his poems, which is called Do Anubhutiyan, right? So you might have come across this, where he contrasts his own experiences of how world was versus world should be type. So the first parts of the Anubhuti, the pehli Anubhuti says that बेनकाब चेहरे हैं, दाग बड़े गहरे हैं, टूटा तिलिस्मा आज सच से भय खाता हूँ, गीत नहीं गाता हूँ. When that is the despondency which used to be there in the politics, when in the public life. And the dusri anubhuti is that which he imagines the country to kind of usher in or wake up to, was the Geet Naya Gata Hu. Prachi mein Arunama ki rek dekh pata hu, Geet Naya Gata Hu. So I think that, I mean, Kal ki kapal pe likhta hu, mitata hu. So the fact that he challenged the status quo and he gave that ambition to various people to young people of that time that India could be a strong power. We could believe in ourselves. We could take on the world in different areas. I think that mindset change to me was his personally his biggest contribution.
Yeah. No, one more poem actually comes to mind. One of my favorite Vajpayee poems. So he had talked about the creation of the Sangh, and doesn't mention which Sangh. Is it the RSS or is it the Jan Sangh? Right. So that poem goes, कभी थे अकेले हुए आज इतने नहीं तब डरे तो भला अब डरेंगे विरोधों के सागर में चट्टान हैं हम जो टकराएंगे मौत अपनी मरेंगे. So that was, I mean, throughout his political life, that was the kind of arc, right? So the tenacity, the grit, the courage, I think just an individual, like I said, without any parallel. I mean, very few people like him in world history, actually, I would go to the extent of saying.
Yeah. Likewise, I mean, I can't agree more. To me, Vajpayee ji signified a triumph against the odds, to remain committed, as Rajiv mentioned, to an ideological goal and to endure hardship for 30, 40 years and finally see fruition is something that's phenomenally inspiring. In some ways, I wonder, how can such a person not be underrated, but hopefully he will not be underappreciated. And hopefully he will gain the recognition and the laurels that he deserves, right? All right. Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you, Ashish. This has been a super insightful, 2-hour discussion on Bharat Varta. Thank you again for your time. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you all on another podcast. Until then, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshan, for having us.